Jesus said to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And so he dives in and really examines this. What does that mean? What does it look like?
I think that's like a deep desire of the human experience is we want to be seen, known, and heard for who we are. And we often have to hide our shame and hide our brokenness because of judgment or shame. But Jesus, he sort of strips that all back and just says, I see you.
Jesus did not require these sinners to change or be converted or be what we would call saved or follow him before he spent time with them. He would go into these houses, spend time with people who were absolute outcasts, unclean, who would have been despised in that culture.
Hey there, and welcome to the Upside Down People podcast. I'm your host, Caleb, and I'm so glad that you've joined with us here today. This is a podcast where we have gospel-centered conversations with people who love Jesus and basically explore and hear some stories on how Christians engage within this current cultural moment. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channels or follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. With that said, I'm so excited for you guys to hear this conversation, so let's jump into it together. Well, welcome to the Upside Down People podcast. I'm joined here with Susy Flory and Scott Johanningsmeier. Did I get that right, Scott?
Close enough. Johanningsmeier is how it's pronounced.
Johanningsmeier, yeah. I am part of my family's originally from South Africa, so the Joha is always if you're from that part of the world or even Netherlands, it's like a yo, but Johanningsmeier. Great. I'm so excited to be having a conversation with you guys here today, primarily because it's around Jesus, which I love conversations around Jesus, and we'll get into it in a second. But before we do, maybe we'll start with you, Susy, just to add some flesh to who you are for our audience. And I know you're a New York Times bestseller. You've also got your master's degree. You both have your master's degree from Northern Seminary in New Testament. And yeah, just give us a bit of flesh around who you are, maybe what you enjoy doing, and anything else you think is important.
Yeah, I have to admit, Caleb, I'm still reeling because about 3 weeks ago I graduated with my doctorate, actually. So that
congratulations.
Thank you. Since the book came out, and there was a little bit of a letdown because you're pushing so hard for those years and all the work involved. So I'm just now, stopping feeling depressed about finishing school.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah,
I feel like that gives some insight into who you are. So you're someone who really enjoys studying if you're just getting over that state of melancholy for not being able to continue in doing your doctoral research.
That's right. I don't have the same excuse to buy books now. I'm going to have to slow down on my book purchases. But I'm hoping that my studies will continue in the form of a book. So I just actually wrote a book proposal, and hopefully we'll be able to find a publishing home for that. So I'm a writer. I love to write. I love to read. And I also live in the mountains. So I'm very well grounded in a rural lifestyle, actually. And we like to get out and ski and hike, and we have bears and mountain lions and all of that. So I think I would say I have a split personality. I love the city and libraries and museums and school. And then I also love being out in the woods.
Brilliant. And what about yourself, Scott?
Well, I am, I guess first and foremost, I'm a bivocational pastor of a very small country church. Susy refers to me as the cornfield pastor because I always make the joke that to find our church, you have to get lost because it's the church that's inside of a cornfield, that's inside of a cornfield, that's inside of a cornfield.
Wow.
But, so it's a small community and a small congregation, and I really love being the pastor there. And I've been there for over 10 years now. And I say that I was really gifted for this because it's hard to be a small church pastor because you often get left out of all the big stuff or you're busy, especially being bivocational, working a full-time job. And my undergrad's in music technology. So I work in the AV install, installing sound systems in churches and football stadiums and all sorts of stuff. So I'm very busy, and it takes a very special gifting to be able to do that and do it well on all accounts. And I feel that this has really been my calling, and it really played out in going to seminary and doing all that, and then writing a book on top of it and all this stuff. It really fit into who I am. So just like Susy, I like being busy.
Yeah, definitely sounds like it. And so a question is, you guys wrote the book together. How did you find each other? Was it through studying, or because, Susy, you're from California, and Scott, you're from Indiana, opposite sides of the country almost. How did you come to write this book together?
Well, we became friends.
Go ahead.
We became friends, and we actually went through all the same classes in our master's program at Northern Seminary. So it was a cohort model. So when the group that you start with on your first class, you work through the entire program with them. And so the majority of the contributors in this book were in our cohort or were in the same New Testament program, maybe at a different time, a year before or after us. So we all connected that way and really became good friends and have stayed good friends even since graduation.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's so special as well that you've had like that journey with your cohort through. How many years is that? Is that 2 or 3 years?
It was a 4-year program.
4-year program. Wow. Yeah. Huge. So tell me about, your book, Jesus Was Not What We Expected, but Better Than We Imagined. Where did it originate from? Why did you decide to write it? And let's start from there.
Yeah, one area in which we were fortunate is that our professor that was in charge of our cohort, and really the reason a lot of us went to that school, his name is Scott McKnight, and he's a well-known writer. He writes academically, and he also writes ordinary books for regular people like us. And from day one, he said, I'm going to help you learn how to write theologically. I'm going to teach you how to write. I'm going to encourage you to write. And he wanted us not to just to learn, but also be able to use it in ministry and in writing, in that communication form. And so he made us read certain things because of the writing, and he would talk about writing. So I think that was kind of in the forefront of my mind for sure, being a writer. And so when we got to this point where we started to discuss the book, it actually happened because of a Facebook post. Like a lot of people, I'm on Facebook. A lot of writers are on Facebook. And we had an event in the U.S. on January 6th, a few years ago, where a huge mob of people attacked the Capitol. And no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, you could turn on the TV that day or be watching things on social media and see the intensity of it and see the violence of it, no matter if you agreed with it or not. And so it was just kind of a horrific day. And, I was upset, didn't really know what to do. I couldn't jump on a bus and go protest or something like that. You're just a bystander, really. And so just drawing on our studies, drawing on, what I had learned about Jesus, I just thought, this is not Jesus. Jesus would not be hurting people. He never knowingly hurt anyone physically, that we have recorded. He was a gentle, kind person with people. And except when he was, dressing down religious leaders. But he was just a kind person and nonviolent. So I was thinking, what am I going to write? I want to write something. People were ranting and arguing, very intense on social media. Facebook's kind of where I hang out. And so I just wrote, Jesus was nonviolent. And it was a 3-word post. And there were dozens and dozens of responses. So instead of arguing and fighting, people just started having a conversation on this post. And I thought, well, the next day I thought I'll do something else. So I wrote Jesus was, and then another word or two. And I ended up doing that for 30 days. I've never done anything before or since like that. And it sparked a lot of conversation from people all over the political spectrum, all over the religious spectrum. And I felt happy because I could bring what I was learning about Jesus, and it cut through sort of all the religious lines, the traditional lines, the dogmatic stuff, the political stuff. And people were just it felt like a little spot of sanctuary to talk about something that many of us care about or are curious about. And then that's where Scott kind of enters the picture.
Yeah, and I remember seeing that first post, and my first thought was, Susie, you're crazy. Because you don't go on social media like that unless you want to argue. And we see that, people will jump in and argue all the time. And so it was like, whoa, what you're saying is huge. And I was impressed by it. And then I did open up those comments, which is also dangerous in and of itself. But I was inspired because people were curious.
Wow.
People were asking the questions, well, what about, Jesus made a whip. What about that? Or what about this? Or tell us more about Jesus and people were curious and wanting to find out more about Jesus. And so once Susie said, I'm going to start posting stuff for 30 days, I started reading all of them and reading the comments. And every day it was positive. People were wanting to know more about Jesus, which is great for me as a pastor. And so it's beginning of the year, and I was gone through my, we've finished with Christmas. We've turned over the new year. Now, what am I going to do leading up to Easter? I was like, what better than to talk about the life of Jesus? So I sent Susie a message. I'm like, hey, I want to take your Jesus was statements you're doing that and turn it into a sermon series. And she's like, great, do it. Let me know what your church thinks. And so we started this conversations back and forth about what we're seeing on her posts, about the way my church is responding to the sermons I'm giving. I'm coming up with different Jesus was statements that she hadn't thought of yet. And then the next day, that would be the Jesus was statement she posted, and just this back and forth, very organic conversations that were all focused on tell us more about Jesus.
Wow.
In the midst of everything that's going on in the world, and especially in the midst of everything that was happening in the U.S. when we first started writing this, let alone even today, now that the book is published, people are like, I want to know more about the Jesus of the Bible and who he was and what he stood for. And so it just went from there. And after Susie finished those 30 days of posts and I finished off my sermon series, we kind of took a couple weeks to just decompress. And then she sent me a message. She's like, you want to write a book? I was like, let's do it.
That's so cool. Yeah. There's so many questions. One of them, why do you think it was so surprising that people were engaging curiously in the comment section of those posts, Susie?
Well, as we're talking about this, I'm also recalling this was right during the height of the pandemic, which was a huge political, argumentative, contentious situation in the U.S. So we not only had, this violent situation around the election, we had people arguing about masks and things like vaccinations.
Yeah.
So I think people were relieved to talk about something that was not political and not around COVID. Do you think that was part of it? I think people could sense that we were listening. You know, I mean, a lot of times if you're a speaker, writer, influencer, you're putting all this stuff out there. We were listening to people. And I think people wanted to be heard, wanted to ask questions, wanted to express themselves. So it felt like just one of those moments where it actually becomes beautiful on social media, where you can talk to people that you live in a different place from who, you know, might have very different views from you and just have a conversation. So I think it really, there was something about it that cut through all of the confusion and chaos. And I think that's when Jesus is the best, right? When he's true and that he's a light and he, there's, you know, some basic beliefs. And I think that was coming through a little bit.
Yeah, that's so cool. And would you say the book is written for Christians or for seekers or for people? I know America's sort of demographic is very different to Australia in the sense of even if you're a non-Christian, there's still that like underlying fundamental belief that there's something there or there's an understanding, where Australia is a very secular country. So what did you have a person in mind that you're writing the book for?
Yeah, we actually had, and we challenged, because we've got 19 different contributing authors that all, like we said, all went to school, seminary with us. And so we challenged them to really have 3 groups in mind when they're writing. One was for Christians who look at all the stuff going on in the world today and are, you know, just hurt and confused by seeing Jesus used in ways that don't relate to the Jesus that they read in the Bible. And they need reassurance of the God they know. The other group was people who are Christians but have never really dove deep into the gospel to find out who Jesus really was and need to be presented with a Jesus that's real and authentic. And then the third group was people on the outside who look at all that chaos in the world, and especially the chaos that's done in the name of Jesus, and say, why would anyone want to follow that? And so those were the 3 groups that we really challenged our authors to think about. So we didn't want to write just for people who were seminary trained, academic, who can read all the academic words, but we wanted to speak to the grandmother sitting in the pew. We wanted to speak to our friends who know that we're ministers, know that we're Christians, but aren't religious themselves. And I think as we go through, we have a really good blend of reaching these people specifically. And I think it does a really good job at touching those lives.
Yeah, brilliant. What surprised you most about who Jesus is or who Jesus was when you started compiling that list of 30 days and really diving into the study of Jesus? Was there any particular attribute or part of his character that you were just really drawn to or really just blown away by?
Ironically, Caleb, it was an Australian. So one of our fellow students in our cohort, his name is Peter Green, and he lives in Australia. And so he would dial in when we were at our online classes. We had online and in person. He would fly for the in person, but he would be, dial in the middle of the night, show up on Zoom, and go to class with us. It was so much fun. He wrote a chapter about Jesus was a friend of sinners. Jesus spent time with sinners. And, there's a song about that Americans sing, and we know the verses and we know what he did and we know he got criticized. The point Peter made, and this was actually controversial, not only when we received it, it got our attention, but when it went through the editorial process at the publisher, we had at least two theological editors who were, really looking carefully at the theology, and then we had a couple of other kinds of editors, and almost all of them question Peter's chapter. And what Peter said is that Jesus did not require these sinners to change or be converted or be what we would call saved or follow him before he spent time with them. So he would go into these houses, spend time with people who were absolute outcasts, unclean, who would have, been despised in that culture. And he didn't just say hi or hand them some food. He was spending time with them. And he did not require, say, prostitutes who were often slaves during that time and did not have a choice about their sexual safety and, being chaste. They couldn't if they were a slave. And so Jesus did not require them to transform before he spent time with them. I just love that. I will never forget it. It's something that changed me.
That's pretty significant. Like if you think about Jesus entering into like humanity, entering into our pain and suffering, and then you like caveat that with he'll spend time with you on the basis that you will change. I can see how that's like, it's almost like manipulation and less loving and less humble. But to actually spend time with sinners, we're all sinners, but with people who in the public eye were outcasts, with no expectation, but the desire, obviously wanting them to change, but just seeing them. I think that's like a deep like desire of the human experience, is we want to be seen, known, and heard for who we are. And we often have to hide our shame and hide our brokenness because of judgment or shame. But Jesus, he sort of strips that all back and just says, I see you. And I love that. That is powerful, I think. What about for yourself, Scott? Was there anything in particular for you?
Yeah, well, I'll just reiterate real quick that chapter by Peter was just powerful, and it's the one that always, whenever this type of question, what's something that really stood out, that's one that I always go to. Another one is very similar to it. It's written by Leo Diaz, who is a first-generation Cuban American, and he wrote a chapter very similar, but it was Jesus was loving of his enemies. And so Leo begins the chapter reflecting about when Fidel Castro died and the response and the reaction to that by the Cuban American community. Because here's Castro, the dictator of Cuba. People fled Cuba. His family fled and came to America. And people rejoicing at his death, which it's, yes, an evil person was gone. But as people were celebrating, as people were wrestling with the hurt and pain of it, he actually begins talking about this gentleman who was reflecting on it, and he could never say Castro's name. He always referred to him as that man.
Wow.
Then Leo started reflecting and thinking about, okay, yes, my community, my culture is happy, is grateful that this man's gone. But Jesus said to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And so he dives in and really examines this. What does that mean? What does it look like? How does it impact him as a Cuban American? How does that impact me as a Midwestern American today in the year, 2026? How does this relate? What does that mean to truly love your enemy in the way that Jesus taught it? And so there's a lot, and there's other powerful ones for me. Another one real quick was Bethany Hammer wrote a chapter called Jesus Was Prayerful. And this one really impacted me because I've loved reading Jesus's prayers and stuff, but she reflects upon how she felt when, as a teenager, her mother passed, and the things that people talked to her. And her prayers were not always what we consider the most holy. And she questioned. She got in, and that's okay. And we see that even in Jesus's prayers, and just seeing this thing that we think Jesus, gets and does his prayers and moves on. But even in those prayers himself, he wrestles and he dives in and he's honest with his prayers. And so that was real eye-opening as well. And I think, honestly, Susie and I could go through and say each of these chapters, because we've had lots of conversations about this of like, whoa, did you catch this in so-and-so's chapter?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, but did you see this as well? And so there were a lot of those moments that really jump out.
It sounds like it was not just a fulfilling book to write, but it was quite exciting in the sense of like just stirring an affection for who Jesus is. A question that I had is, it sounds like a lot of, or a few of the things you've mentioned have challenged like both cultural narratives that we may have of Jesus, but also traditional narratives of who Jesus was. How important do you think that conversation is, to be having a conversation around the identity of Jesus in a time that is really there's so much anxiety in culture right now. There's so much uncertainty about what the future holds, and also like you see, you just see different responses to. In Australia, we recently had one of our darkest days in history, anti-Semitic massacre at Bondi, and even in that, you saw it's actually quite incredible. So there's one man who disarmed the gunman. He got shot while he was doing that, but he disarmed him, didn't retaliate, but made sure that like people around him were safe. But he entered into it, disarmed him, and then there's another man who, while people were tackling the other gunman, just started stomping on his head. And here's in a news interview afterwards, and he said, I knew like he was already restrained, but I just wanted to do that. And you have these two different responses of like, one was like entering into a violent situation and not acting violently in retaliation. And another one was like, it's almost an unsolicited violence in a sense of he was already restrained and withheld, yet he chose to enact his violence on it. So it's like the culture seems very anxious, very like incited to violence in response to these different things. But then when we look at who Jesus was, how does that challenge our narratives?
Jesus had every shred of power that his Father had, that God had. He was God in human form. He could have immediately and visibly changed the course of history without, a lot of what happened to him. But yet he submitted. And I think it's something when you follow Jesus that you have to tangle with your entire life, is why did Jesus do what he did? Why did he submit to that kind of humiliating treatment? He was restrained. He went through, all sorts of just humiliation and a very humiliating death that was meant for the worst of the worst kind of criminal that the Romans wanted to make an example of. And so just trying to puzzle through that, and yet he did not retaliate. He did not strike anyone dead. He did not do the opposite of healing, which he could have done, right? He could have stricken anyone at any point with any sort of, violence or disease or process or whatever. And I think that's something that we try to do in this book, is to slow down the narrative. The stories. We hear these stories, they become sort of ingrained in us when you go to church. Or you hear bits and pieces. If you're not really a churchgoer, you just hear little bits and pieces or see things. And what we try to do is really slow down and invite people to question why Jesus did certain things, why he said certain things, and what that means. So to me, that's what's powerful, is just really looking at what Jesus said and did, and trying to sit with it and trying to make sense of it, when a lot of it really doesn't make a lot of sense.
Right.
Yeah, and that's really why we went with this title, Jesus Was. It was, Susy said there was no thought behind her first Facebook post about putting Jesus was nonviolent. She just did. But as we start diving into it, we start thinking about that slowing down narrative of Jesus was instead of Jesus is. Because in the church today, we always, Jesus was resurrected. Jesus is still alive today. So Jesus is. We always use the word Jesus is. But to truly understand who Jesus is today, we have to look at who he was as recorded in the Gospels, because that's the best account that we have of who Jesus was when he was on earth. He is the perfect example, as Susy said, of the Father, of God himself. And for us to know that and to understand that, we have to look at who he was. But we've gone through years and years and years of tradition, of years and years of people manipulating the story and the narrative as well, and really focusing on different elements. That's why we have people on both sides of the same argument using the scriptures as their basis. And it does create a lot of confusion. And so when we look at all the violent, like you said, that great example where you have one person who did not retaliate in violence, who stopped the violence but didn't retaliate, and one who did retaliate even almost after it was over. We see that same sort of thing play out throughout history, and even today, everything that goes on. And I think for us, with this book and with the idea of Jesus was, it makes us slow down. It makes us reflect on who was Jesus, and is the Jesus that I say is today, is that who he was? Or do I need to reevaluate? Do I need to re-examine? Do I need to look at it through a new lens and a new perspective? And so I think that's really the strength of this book, and with this Jesus was, because it makes us do that, because we're so used to is today.
Right. So what I'm hearing is the statement Jesus is can be loaded and layered with a bunch of preconceived, pre-perceived ideas of who Jesus is. So you sort of trying to strip all of those layers away and get back to the core of what does Scripture say who Jesus was, and paint that picture for people to understand and to grasp. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that really sums it up real well, because there is so much preconceived ideas and notions and stuff, and when you're able to just step back, and it's like anything in our life. I've given the example before of I love sci-fi movies. I'm a huge Star Wars fan, but I can watch the movies and I can even fall asleep in the middle of it, wake up at some point and know what the next line is because I've seen it so many times. But I have young daughters, and when they watched it for the first time, I saw it in a new perspective, because it wasn't just through my eyes, but seeing it through her eyes for the first time again. And that was really powerful. And I think that's very much the same thing when we step back from our preconceived ideas and we see it new. It reveals so much to us.
So in this process, was there a common way, or maybe one way that stood out more than the rest, or one lens, I should say, not way, one lens that stood out more than the rest of how people perceive who Jesus is or who Jesus was, and how that impacts the reality of who Jesus is? Does that make sense? Was there like a lens that people put on that actually it blurs the vision, the actual identity, the actual character of who Jesus is, something that's happening currently, and yeah, that perception of we've painted him in our own image to suit our whatever it is, our own individualism or self-fulfillment, or you name it. Was there something that you came across that you're like, man, this particularly is striking how common this happens, and this needs to be addressed?
I think that for many of us today that live in, first world countries, and we're not hungry and we're not oppressed and we don't have an empire that's, threatening us, and we're affluent in a lot of ways, right? We don't have to worry about where our next meal is coming from. I think it's hard for us in a way to understand what life was like for Jesus and his family and his friends during that time with the Roman Empire looming over them, torturing people, not allowing them freedom. They were really an oppressed people. And so I think, being able to kind of come at it that Jesus was not about earthly power. And yet so often he's co-opted for earthly power, and it comes in many forms, including in churches. So I think just approaching who Jesus was and what we can learn from him with humility, with questions, with learning, and not as a tool of power.
Yeah,
And it happens so easily.
Yeah, that is a huge one. I'm reminded of, I can't remember where the scripture is, but it's just before Jesus washes his disciples' feet. The verse above it, it says, knowing he had all power, the next thing he decides to do is like obviously significant. It's like, what do we do with power? If we know we have power, and we look to Jesus as our example, is he washed his disciples' feet. He lowered himself, and I was like, I think you've hit the nail on the head there as well. It's like, that is something so true of human nature, is we want power and we want to be able to use it to our advantage, yet we look at Jesus and completely upside down, completely countercultural.
Yeah, and that example you gave is actually the target point of one of my chapters that I wrote, was Jesus was a servant. And the interesting thing about that is when you read the scriptures, Judas was in the room. Jesus knew what was going to happen, and Jesus still washed Judas's feet. That's powerful, because if you ask us about that, would you wash the feet of the person that's going to take your house? Or would you wash the feet of the person that's going to cheat you out of your money? No, we wouldn't. But yet, what is that Jesus humbled himself like a servant, still did that. And then the beautiful thing at the end of that little section is he looks at his disciples and says, do you understand why I did this? Because I, your teacher and master, got down and humbled myself. Go do the same.
That's powerful. Yeah. What do you think would happen if people truly grasped the things you guys have written about in this book, and sort of tried to embody it by the power of his Spirit? What do you think the church would look like?
For me, I see there are people who live like that. And I use Scott as an example all the time, honestly, when I'm talking, because my last church was a mega church. You know, there's a lot of mega churches out there. They're big and a lot of people belong to them. So a lot of us have had these mega church experiences. There were good people there and the church did good things. But it was, I think, harder to do what we're talking about because you're insulated, you're in this bubble. It's performative in a way, you know, it's these big stages and things going on, and there's nothing wrong with great music and, you know, having fun together and learning together, but it takes over. It's so insidious, and it's just, you know, pastor after pastor who falls to that kind of temptation. I really would love to see us in small churches. I think that was what the early church was like. It's very hard to get a big head when you have a church of 25 or 30 or 40 people. It's hard for someone to get lost. There's something very humbling about being in a smaller church community, church family, and taking care of each other. And you're still going to have people like a Judas, you know, who's struggling and who's tempted and who may have, you know, negative motives, but you're still supposed to take care of that person and care for them. And it's easy not to do it in a big context. It's much harder not to live like Jesus when you're in a smaller context. So I don't know.
That was the attraction of the early church as well, because you had the slaves, you had the poor, you had the people who were the outcasts, and that was the foundational group of the early church. And then you had some wealthy, some landowners, some even slave owners who came in that group, and to see the people on equal grounds was very, very attractive. And that's what really caused it to grow. And I think, as Susie mentioned, there's a lot of really, really good disciples of Jesus today who are followers of Jesus. We tend to hop on the talking heads because it's big, it's loud, it's controversial, it grabs our attention, and so it causes us to overlook the really good work that's going on. And I think, and speaking as a small church pastor, I think the more people that we have that say, I'm not going to tune into that, but I'm going to represent Christ, people take notice of that. And at my day job, you know, several years ago, we had two of the guys in my work who aren't Christians, who, you know, one considers himself atheist, one considers himself agnostic, and they were talking about the fighting in the church and some of the evil sins that have happened in the church, you know, abuse children, all this stuff. And one of them just jumped and laid a blanket statement down that, you know, all Christians, and the other one said, but what about Scott? He's not like that. And I think the more of us that decide I'm going to live like Jesus did, the more people will say, there's something different about those people. What is it? Oh, they are following Jesus more than just doctrine or traditions or church dogma.
Right.
They're diving into who Jesus was and is, and we see it lived out in their lives. That is what makes a difference.
That's so good. How, yeah, just as you guys were speaking, the question that came to my mind is how do we not put Jesus into a category of like a good moral person who we can set our attention on to live a good life that loves people well, and miss the potential like gold of it, that he is our savior, he is our Lord, and he is our King. I suppose the question deeper than that is rooted in something that I've noticed over the past few years, particularly with young people drawn to prominent voices like Jordan Peterson, they've really done incredible work in terms of like advocating for freedom of speech and advocating for like standing for the truth. But then noticing there is this subtle drive towards morality, and it's like a legalism, a moral legalism that empowers you. So you want to be a good person and do the right thing. And I sort of see that leading to like a Pharisaical way of living, potentially. Is that something you guys have noticed? And yeah, how do we look at who Jesus was and allow him to transform our lives and not just want to imitate him because we'll get something out of it?
I was thinking, Caleb, of a famous American named Benjamin Franklin. And I used to teach high school, secondary school, and we studied him because he was an interesting guy and an interesting writer. And he had a system of moral perfection that he invented. So he carried little notebooks and he made all these categories that he's working on. And he decided he was going to be a perfect person. And so every day he would check off if he did the right thing in all these categories. And he said he was doing really well. After 6 or 7 weeks, he had perfected these categories except for the pride one, because he was really proud that he was doing so well. And there's some humor to it, but he recognized that because he was so successful, because he was an accomplished person and brilliant, I mean, he was a genius with his inventions, he had a lot of pride and he didn't need God because he had done this all by himself. And I think that's really the key, is that there is no such thing as attaining perfection. You know, we are only human. And so I think acknowledging that imperfection, acknowledging that we're not God, and it happens when we mess things up, right? All of us mess things up. Relationships, we hurt people, we hurt ourselves. We can't, it's like trying to be sober. If you're an addict, it is really hard to do on your own. And to me, that's something I think everyone can relate to. And we can't ever, when we're in positions of leadership, act like we're perfect and not tell our broken stories of being broken.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Yeah, and we also have chapters, because we've been talking about a lot of those practical ones about what it means to love your enemies, or be a friend to sin, or be a servant, or do all that. But one of the things that we also hit on the book was the divinity of God. And so one of our contributors, Heather Hart, is very big into who Jesus is as God. And so we've got chapters in there such as Jesus was the God human, and how Jesus is the perfect representation of God. We've got that Jesus was veil tearing, what it means that Jesus came and opened up this great rift that reveals God to us and how we can know him better. We've got ones that are like Jesus was dependent, about how Jesus wasn't just acting on his own, but he required the interaction and had that interaction with God the Father and with the Spirit. And we see them all together at once. We have Jesus was instrumental in our adoption, looking at concepts of adoption, but then how through that Jesus chose us and pulls us in to be part of his family. And so there is a balancing that does require, because the element that everybody always points to with the other side of Christianity is that you're too legalistic, or that you're too legal. There's always that you're just nitpicking this back and forth. But having that good balance of Jesus, because of his divinity, because of who he is in his relationship with God, has called us to be his people here on earth. And what does that mean? So we don't live that way because that's what we're supposed to do to get into heaven. Like the teacher, what must I do to get eternal life? Well, have you obeyed all the commands? I've obeyed them since I was a kid. We need to understand that balance. We, because we have been brought into the family of God, are called to live differently.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I love that. Just slightly shifting gears, something I usually do with my guests is I'll ask our previous guests a question that they have for our next guest. So I'll do that with you guys in a second. But our previous guest asked, do you realize that you have an inner life of thoughts, feelings, and desires? And then putting on like a perception lens, how does that show how you live on if someone was watching on camera? Yeah. So whoever wants to go first, it's a deep question. But yeah, I think it's great.
Scott, why don't you tackle that one first?
Say it one more time so I can make sure I get it right.
Yeah. Do you realize you have an inner life of thoughts, feelings, and desires? And then how does that show you as a person if someone was watching on camera?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I grew up in a very traditional, conservative faith. And so that's one of the things that's really, I don't want to say beat into you, but it's beat into you that you have your desires and there's always this struggle back and forth. So it's always there in the back of my mind, even today, years later, of this understanding of it. And so it's always there, but really realizing what that means, whether it means what I was taught as a kid or what it is now. But there are these things that are always poking and prodding at us. And for me, myself, as I'm going through there, I guess the best way to put this is when I was in college, I had a Camaro. And, I was early 20s, fast car, that was great. And I had one of the ichthus on the back bumper of it. And someone asked me, they're like, why are you trying to do that? Do you think that's really going to win anyone to Jesus? And I said, it's not for them, but it's for me when I'm driving, that if I go flying past someone, they will see that, and that will not just reflect on me, but on Christ. And so I had that on there as a, hey, yes, you have a fast car. You don't have to go as fast as you can all the time. Sometimes it's fun, I get it. But I don't need to be zigzagging in and out because of how it reflects, not just on me, but on the one that I follow. And so, yes, for me, that's always a thing that's going on of what are the inner thoughts and desires that are going on. Just like back to, road rage, speaking of cars, someone cuts me off, I could get angry and yell at them, or I could just take a breath. And my daughter asked me that one time because someone cut us off real bad. I just slow down, I breathe, and she's like, why didn't you honk at them? And I said, because if I honked at them, what could come from that? Do I distract them and cause something else to happen? Do I lose focus on what I'm focused on and turn all my attention to that? How do I stand with myself? So I think that really, especially for those of us who are really focused in on who Jesus was, it's always reflected in who we are and the way that we live out our desires and how they speak to us. So did that give you time to think, Susie?
Well, just before we go to Susie, so would you say that having like one of those bumper stickers or those outward things, it helps remind you that, hey, people are looking at me a certain way, so I need to be aware of what's internally happening, and it's like a trigger to like connect those two things? Or is it, what does that mean for you?
Yeah, I think so. People know I'm a pastor. And so that does require that living. But even before I became a pastor, there were elements of the people that knew who I was, saw that lived in my life. But the people who I would just meet, didn't know that, but they knew there was something different about me. And when they found out that I'm a person of faith, that I'm a follower of Jesus, that I'm a Christian, like, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Because what we see in how you lived revealed that before you ever even told us. And so that's really the greatest witness that we can have is, yes, there's some, and I'm always cautious telling those stories because I don't want people to like start loading themselves up with Christian shirts or wearing cross necklace or doing all just for that. But it's even a little subtle reminder. The people at my work know I'm a pastor. When I have a rough day, how does that reflect?
Yeah, very good.
So it's a little bit of both in there.
Yeah. What about yourself, Susie?
I was thinking about the desire for knowledge, and for me, I love to read and write. I love to be in school. I love to learn. I love to be around people who make me think. I think that overall that's a great quality, but it can also turn inwards and become unhealthy. And I think that's something I've had to guard against, even though, people around you can be like, oh, that's so great. You're studying, you're getting these degrees, you're doing this, you're doing that. But in your heart of hearts, you know that you're kind of enjoying, consuming all of this. You're enjoying getting smarter. You're enjoying the knowledge that you are gaining. And you can forget that that knowledge is not for you, that you are it's a gift to you that God is allowing you to study and grow and learn, and that needs to be used in his service. It reminds me of, the parable where the master gives his employees, things that they can invest and use to grow the fortune, or they can bury it and just keep it for themselves. And so I think that can happen with desires. They can be healthy on the surface, but they can become unhealthy when we forget why we have them and why, how we're to use that.
Yeah, brilliant. And just returning the favor, what's a question that you would ask our next guest? It's can be anything. It can be funny. It can be as deep as the one you've just received. Yeah, what's an important or meaningful question, do you think?
For me, and the question I always like finding out about people is, who are the influences, like the personal influences in your life, the people that you look back on from when you were growing up that shaped you, and how and why did they shape you that way?
Awesome. And for yourself?
I would agree with Scott. I would look to maybe an older person. As I look back on my life, there have been a string of older people who showed an interest in me for some reason, and who said they would pray for me, or who would stop and encourage me, or talk to me at a very low time, and it seemed to inevitably be someone with gray hair. And so I think looking back, who is that person that you needed at a certain time in your life, and they just showed up out of nowhere? Where sometimes we sideline older people. We feel like they don't have anything to say anymore. And that has not been the case in my life. I mean, there's a lot of people that have come along at certain times in my life. So who was that person for you?
Yeah, brilliant. I love both those questions. And someone recently asked me, like, if you were 85 years old, looking at your life now, what's something that you'd want to tell yourself now, so that when you're 85, you're a certain type of person? And I was reflecting, I was like, the old people that I've thoroughly enjoyed conversations around have had a profound humility. So it's like they have so much wisdom, so much life experience, so much knowledge, yet they have a humility and this deep encouragement to notice and see the person they're speaking to. And I'm like, I want to be that person who, when they're 80 years old or 85 or however old, is to be able to see a person and make them feel heard in a conversation and be able to encourage them, because that's what's really impacted myself. And I'm like, I just find it so incredible, because it's like the truth is they have so much to offer, and they've chosen to offer it in a way that's I'm just reminded and drawn to Jesus in that moment, because I'm like, I feel like that's what Jesus does. And that's how our hearts are transformed. So I love both those questions. I think they're great. I've really enjoyed having this conversation with you guys. I know we've just touched the surface and there's so much more depth that we could dive into. If someone was looking to find out either more about you guys or to grab a copy of your book, where would you direct them to?
We have a website, and it's jesuswasbook.com. And then we also have a Substack newsletter. We have some interviews there, sort of a little mini podcast and some articles. So either one of those, Jesus Was Substack or jesuswasbook.com.
Awesome.
And the book's available at all the places where you buy books. It's on the Amazons, the Barnes & Noble. You can get it. It's on Kindle. It's a different ebook, so you can get it there available. And also through our publisher, Kriegel, it's available on their website as well.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, to both you, Susy and Scott, for the conversation and the time and just the work and the thought that you've put into this book and how important it is, I feel like, in this cultural moment, to be able to actually slow down, strip away whatever lenses are distracting us from who Jesus was, and really get to the heart of who he was and is. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks for having us. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Thanks, Caleb.